The artist and writer Oskar Kokoschka was born in 1886 in the town of Purchlan, Austria. His mother came from a family of foresters in Lower Austria, his father from a celebrated line of goldsmiths in Prague. When Oskar was born, his father worked as a commercial traveller for a jewellery firm. At 18, he was granted a scholarship to attend the School of Arts and Crafts in Vienna, where he would later work as an assistant teacher. This is the same school where Adolf Hitler had applied and was rejected. Kokoschka reflected on this. Hitler, unfortunately, failed the exam. If I had failed in his place, the world would have been spared a good deal of misery. Hitler would have become a bad painter, and I should have become a reasonable, understanding politician. Among Kokoschka's early works, dated 1909, was this portrait of Moritz Hirsch, a rich Hungarian businessman who settled in Vienna in 1887. The artist described Hirsch as an irascible and stubborn old man. His false teeth, a detail usually hidden in the art of portraiture, here captures our attention, while the impasto testifies to the artist's knowledge of Van Gogh. Shocked by this depiction, the public accused Kokoschka of caricaturing his models. Hirsch, however, accepted the portrait, paid the artist, and hung it in his home. Art historians Hans and Erika Tietze commissioned Kokoschka to paint a marriage portrait in a Renaissance style for their mantelpiece. The artist painted them separately, their separation enhanced by their introspective expressions, connected only by the proximity of their outstretched hands. During the sittings, Hans and Erika were allowed to carry on their daily routine, walking, talking, and writing letters. The thin layers of colours create a hazy atmosphere, made more dynamic by the scratching marks left by the artist. In 1910, Oskar Kokoschka painted the portrait of Auguste Forel, a renowned Swiss psychiatrist and scientist. Then, 24 years old, the artist created a remarkably expressive portrait. He broke away from the idealization of the human figure and represented the scientist in a blurry, almost unreal space. Yet the portrait did not please his client, as Forel considered that this work belonged more to the field of psychiatry than to that of art, and refused to buy it. Kokoschka first met Alma Mahler, the widow of composer Gustav Mahler, on April 12, 1912 in Vienna. It was the beginning of a tragic love story that would end just 3 years later. One of Vienna's most extraordinary women, Alma Mahler, was initially infatuated with Kokoschka. They lived and travelled together, and he painted her many times. However, Kokoschka's emotional outbursts were unpredictable. He loved passionately and unconditionally, as Alma Mahler later reflected. The 3 years with him were a battle of love. Never before have I tasted so much hell and so much paradise. As early as July 1912, Alma became pregnant by Kokoschka. When she terminated the pregnancy 3 months later, he took the blood-soaked cloth she gave to him and carried it home. "That is my only child and will always be so," he said. Later, he continually carried this soiled piece of cloth with him. Kokoschka never overcame his pain at the loss of their child and made it the subject of numerous drawings. Two lovers are painted lying side by side as the sea around them rages. The woman sleeps, unaware of the shadows of reality that increase in size with each passing hour of the night. The man remains awake, his fingers ugly and twisted, chin protruding. This painting represents the painter and his lover Alma Mahler, carried by the wind of passion and uncertainty. It honours the fleeting nature of love and passion and political instability that affects everyone. It is now regarded as one of the greatest expressionist paintings of the 20th century. Painted in 1914, a year in which the relationship ended, war broke out, and Kokoschka sold the painting to buy a horse as he enlisted in the Imperial Dragoons. Wounded in the head and the lungs on the Russian front in 1915, he was treated in hospital in Brno. Wounded again by the explosion of a grenade, he was evacuated to Vienna and then to Berlin. Kokoschka recovered in a sanatorium in the suburbs of Dresden. He quickly became acquainted with the artistic and intellectual circles of the city. Originally entitled The Card Players, the Friends records these new encounters. In the painting, Kokoschka portrays himself with his back turned in the company of an actress, poets, and a celebrated psychiatrist of the day. This painting was seized from German collections in 1937 and, along with other works by Kokoschka, was presented in the exhibition of degenerate art organised by the Nazis in Munich. Painted over several months between 1918 and 1920, The Power of Music shows a woman holding a bouquet of lilac flowers and blowing into a Renaissance flute. This appears to surprise a seated young man, as if awoken by the sound. In the distance, a dog walks away from the couple. First titled Weakness and Strength, this work, endowed with an incredible colourful intensity, is a call to awakening through the universal power of music. This painting too was deemed degenerate and seized in 1937. In 1918, several years after his breakup with Alma Mahler, Kokoschka commissioned the artist Hermine Moos to create a life-size doll in her image. Made from swan skin, with the feathers still attached, this fetish doll was created on the instructions that Kokoschka gave Moos, on his aesthetic and tactile expectations of the object. Yesterday I sent a life-size drawing of my beloved, and I ask you to copy this most carefully and to transform it into reality. For the first layer, inside, please use fine curly horsehair. You must buy an old sofa or something similar. Have the horsehair disinfected. Then over that, a layer of pouches stuffed with down, cotton wool for the seat and breasts. The point of all this for me is an experience which I must be able to embrace. The doll was a disappointment to Kokoschka, as can be seen in this painting, where he points disdainfully at the doll as she looks away. Having invested in the doll, Kokoschka committed to using it, included it in many drawings, paintings and photographs. Dressing her in costumes, he even took the doll out on carriage rides and to the opera. The doll was destroyed in 1922 when, after arranging a party, Kokoschka enacted the last part of the sequence of the object's lifespan, demonstrating the violence of men against women, echoed by many artists of the time. Finally, after I had drawn it and painted it over and over again, I decided to do away with it. It had managed to cure me completely of my passion. So I gave a big champagne party with chamber music, during which my maid Hulda exhibited the doll in all its beautiful clothes for the last time. When dawn broke, I was quite drunk. As was everyone else, I beheaded it out in the garden and broke a bottle of red wine over its head. The death of his father in October 1923 marked a turning point in Kokoschka's career. Supported financially by gallery owner Paul Cassier, Kokoschka began to travel throughout Europe, North Africa and the East. The landscapes, urban scenes, portraits of men and animals that he produced contrast starkly with the style he used in Dresden. His brushstrokes are flowing, and his use of a broader palette introduced new colour relationships and highlights. During this prosperous period, Kokoschka attempted to establish himself in Paris and London by spending much time in both cities. He painted several views of London during spring 1926 after renting a room at the Savoy Hotel on the 8th floor. From his room, he painted this view of the Thames from a high vantage point. Here, Kokoschka tried to create a panoramic vision of the landscape by offering multiple vanishing points. The vivid and luminous colours dissolve in the manner of Turner. Kokoschka was fascinated by animals in which he often detected human characteristics. He painted the mandrill in London Zoo outside public opening times. In the evening, he was admitted to the zoo by zoologist Julian Huxley, brother of Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World. Rather than depict the monkey in his small cage with thick bars, Kokoschka shows it in its natural environment. The suicide of Paul Cassier in 1926, followed by the Great Crash of 1929, weakened Kokoschka financially. Between 1928 and 1930, Kokoschka travelled extensively throughout North Africa. Accompanied by his friend, he arrived in Tourcout, an Algerian city situated in the north of the Sahara, where he commenced a series of portraits, including that of Sidi Ahmed Ben Tijani. In his letters, Kokoschka told of his meeting with the sheikh in a mosque. In dire straits financially, Kokoschka returned to Vienna in 1932 and found the city plagued by serious political troubles linked to the rise of fascism. When Hitler came to power, Kokoschka publicly declared his intention to combat Nazism. In May 1933, in the German daily newspaper Frankfurter Zeitung, he protested against the resignation of Max Liebermann from the Prussian Academy of Arts because of his Jewish background. The painter's mother was still living in Vienna, and during the Civil War of 1934, her health deteriorated and she died. Kokoschka emigrated to Prague, his father's hometown, where his sister Berta lived. From Czechoslovakia, he was able to see the Nazi trap gradually shutting down Europe. Kokoschka published numerous articles and organised conferences to alert people to the danger. During this time, the travelling exhibition of degenerate art displayed 9 of his paintings. Kokoschka responded with this brilliant painting, Self-Portrait as a Degenerate Artist. In Prague, he met Oldřiska Alozzi-Pelkovska, a law student who was to be his future bride. The war forced Kokoschka and Olda to leave Prague after the Munich Agreement, which paved the way for Adolf Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia. "I loved being in Prague," Kokoschka once wrote. As part of his luggage, Kokoschka took an unfinished painting, a landscape of the city of Prague that he completed from memory once in London. Here, the landscape is awash with recollections. Full of nostalgia, he painted the city as an idyllic scenery with radiant colours. The 2 lovers in exile as a couple are shown in the foreground, invited to board a boat. While in exile in England, Oskar Kokoschka did not remain inactive. He had to rebuild everything in a country where his art was not yet acknowledged. With Olda, he lived in relative destitution between London and Polperro in Cornwall. While there, he began a series of war allegories, beginning with The Crab. This work refers to the German occupation. Kokoschka said the swimmer, a self-portrait, represented Czechoslovakia, and the crab, Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister at the time. He explained the crab would only have to put out 1 claw to save him from drowning, but remains aloof. Kokoschka's sources of inspiration were derived from mythological, satirical or popular. The dignity of history of painting is broken by the vulgarity of representations in frantic strokes of humour. In this painting, The Red Egg, the painter depicts a roast chicken prepared to be served, which flies away and drops a red egg on the table. Prague burns in the background. Mussolini sits at the table with Hitler, who is wearing a soldier's helmet made of paper. A cat lies beneath the table with a Napoleonic hat and a cockade. Behind them is the Lion of England, its tail twisted into a pound sign, atop a pedestal reading In Pace Munich. Hitler's mouth is wide open and he appears to be shouting hate-filled tirade from the upper left side of the canvas. Meanwhile, the colossal puffed-up head of Mussolini fills the entire right-hand side of the canvas, echoing the motif of the egg at the centre. One possible interpretation of the painting is that both France, symbolised by the obese cat, and England, represented by the lion that holds court on the 2 books labelled In Pace Munich, are shirking their duties as protecting powers. Kokoschka did not merely comment on the situation. With the creation of posters and publication of articles, he also asserted his pacifism and the necessity of reconciliation. Lorli is undoubtedly one of the most searing of his political paintings. A figure of German mythology, Lorli was a nymph who lured sailors to their ruin with her song. Here, the siren takes on the appearance of Queen Victoria seated on a shark, devouring men in the sea. In the distance, an octopus swims away, with a trident symbolising marine power. In the background, the vessel struck by lightning alludes to the Arandora Star, which was supposed to transport war prisoners to Canada in 1949, but was torpedoed by the Germans. In this painting, Kokoschka expressed his bitterness towards the British military strategy carried out at sea. 1942 was a year of deadlock during the Second World War. Whilst the Soviet Union was battling the Nazis in the east, there were repeated calls for British and American governments to launch a second front in Western Europe. In Marianne McKee, Kokoschka vents his criticism of the Allies' delay by showing British war leaders Winston Churchill and General Montgomery drinking tea in the Café de Paris in Soho. The central figure is Marianne, the traditional personification of France, now linked to the Maquis, the French resistance. Despite the Allied victory, Kokoschka remained politically vigilant, as is shown in this painting, his work Unleashing of Atomic Energy. Exposing the nuclear threat, it depicts the hedonistic blindness of populations who, at the end of the war, do not notice that the clown in the foreground, brandishing a key as a plaything, has opened the cage of the lion, the embodiment of atomic energy. The symbol of peace, the dove, takes fright and flies away. Time, gentlemen, please. The closing time call, so familiar in British pubs, signals for the artist the arrival of Father Time, personified by the bearded figure whose hand is on the latch of the door. Walking towards the door as death beckons, Kokoschka turns momentarily and faces the viewer with one last agonized stare, confronting the inevitability of his death. The vigorous paint handling and intensity of facial expression make this painting a particularly moving example of Kokoschka's late work, akin to its mixture of animation and psychological urgency to the late works of Picasso. Begun when he was 85 years old, this is the last of his many self-portraits.